Did you know that the most haunted house in New Orleans is located at 1140 Royal Street? Did you know that slaves were brutally tortured and killed there? Did you know that the woman responsible for it was likened to Elizabeth Bathory because of her twisted cruelty? Well, that's what I'm going to talk about on this next episode of Peculiar Finds for Curious Minds. And I'm Jennifer Kennedy. Don't forget to check out my website, peculiartalk.com, where you'll find my psychic services that I offer, including psychic readings with tarot readings, oracle readings, and rune readings, as well as psychic services for the police, paranormal teams, and more. You can also find every episode on the website, and you can subscribe to it on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Podomatic, and YouTube. Welcome! On this episode, I'm going to tell you all about Madame Marie Delphine LaLaurie. She was born March 19th, 1787, and she died December 7th in 1849. She was married 3 times, carrying the names Marie Delphine McCarthy and Madame Blanc. Her 3rd marriage, she became Madame LaLaurie. She was a New Orleans Creole socialite, wealthy socialite, who tortured and murdered her slaves in gruesome, twisted ways. She is a serial killer. Her first marriage was to Don Ramon de Lopez, a high-ranking royal Spanish officer, but I couldn't find any information on when he died. She was a widow. Her second marriage was to Jean Blanc. He was a prominent banker, lawyer, merchant, and legislator. So she's keeping the wealth. In that second marriage, she had 4 children, and that husband died in 1816. Her 3rd marriage to Leonard Louis Nicholas LaLaurie was on June 25th, 1825. He was a physician and much, much younger than her. She became pregnant by him, and he married her after she became pregnant. In 1831, she bought the property at 1140 Royal Street in her own name and management, not in her husband's name. In 1832, she had a 2-story mansion built there with an attached slave quarter, and she lived there with her husband and 2 of her daughters. Shortly after she moved in, she established an important social position in the New Orleans society. She became one of the bigwigs in the city, and she maintained that social position up until April 10th, 1834, when rescuers responded to a fire at her home. They found bound slaves in her attic, and the slaves had signs of violent abuse over long periods of time, not just recent abuse, but signs that they had been abused for a long period of time. So let's just jump right into the details. Some reports claim that the details of what happened in this whole story are completely fabricated. Some say that they're severely exaggerated, but that there is some truth, and some say that they are completely true. At the time, rumors swirled around town, and they were indeed exaggerated, but the key details that have remained to date are pretty gruesome. These details were reported by newspapers at the time of the fire, so they're considered to be mostly true, although there's still some people out there that dispute it. So what happened here? Well, first off, before we get to the fire and the whole incident that busted Delphine out, Delphine had been repeatedly investigated for cruelty towards her slaves several times. In 1828, in 1829, and in 1832, when she was reminded by the government about the laws of how slaves were to be treated. Now, at that time, the typical treatment of slaves in Louisiana was actually considered pretty cruel compared to the other standards in all the other states. So things are considered to be truly severe in order to warrant investigations and stern warnings from the authority and government. You're talking about you had cruelty that is typically known towards slaveries, and then she just kind of went above and beyond all that to where they actually had to come in and tell her, hey man, you can't be treating your slaves that way. It's against the law. She was known to beat her slaves severely and chain them up, yet in public she was always kind and courteous to people and other slaves. But when behind closed doors, it was pretty known that she severely beat them and chained them up. People didn't know the true nature of Delphine. There was one story of a 12-year-old slave named Leah. She was said to have accidentally snagged Delphine's hair when brushing it. Hey, this is what set Elizabeth Bathory off too. It's no wonder that Delphine is being compared to Elizabeth Bathory. That's how it all starts. When somebody's brushing a woman's hair. Don't ever brush a woman's hair because you just might make her snap. So she snagged her hair. Delphine was furious and she chased her around the house with a whip. Leah climbed up on top of the roof of the house to escape, and she jumped off committing suicide rather than being whipped. She knew how severe punishment was from Delphine. She did not want to succumb to that torture, so she decided that she would rather die. So she jumped off the roof and she committed suicide. Delphine buried her on the house grounds. Now her death led to an investigation of the LaLauries. They were found to be guilty of illegal cruelty towards the girl, and they were forced to forfeit 9 of their slaves, but they just wound up buying them back. They kind of circumvented the law. They got a relative to buy them, and then they got them from their relative because they couldn't buy them back directly. Delphine was also known to beat her own daughters if they tried to feed her slaves. Her slaves are said to have been emaciated, and it was once noted that they always looked, quote, haggard and wretched. So the daughters would sometimes feel bad for the slaves, and they would try and feed them. But if they got caught, Delphine would just beat the living daylights out of them. So let's get to the big meat of the story. The fire. The way she was busted was the house caught on fire. And it was discovered that she had slaves locked and trapped up in the attic. So how did the fire start? Well, she chained her cook, a 70-year-old slave, to the stove by her ankle, and she was starving her. When the fire marshals found this cook, she told them that she purposely started the fire as a suicide attempt because she feared punishment. She had already been chained. She was already being starved, and apparently Delphine had been threatening to punish her even further, and she was afraid of that punishment. She told the fire marshals that slaves who were taken to the attic never came out. Once they went in, you never saw them again. She was afraid of that. So she decided to start the fire as an attempt to commit suicide in order to escape Delphine. On the day of the fire, many of the neighbors came to try to help put it out. I mean, she is one of the big prominent people of the neighborhood. Everybody's going to go and try and help her. So all the neighbors come over to her house and they try and help put it out. But when they got there, they noticed that Delphine was scrambling to get her furs and her jewelry, but they didn't see any slaves outside. They thought, well, that's kind of odd. Where are all the slaves? They went into the slave quarters to try and find them, and they weren't in there either. But when they went in looking for them, they heard moans and wails. So they went all through the house to try and find the slaves, and they came up to the attic door, and they heard cries behind the attic door. So then they realized, well, that must be where the slaves are. But the door was locked. So they ran outside, and they asked Delphine for the keys. Well, she refused to give them the keys, and she told them to mind their business. So they ran back in the house, and they wound up having to kick the door down to get the slaves out. And when they kicked the door down, they were absolutely horrified when they opened the attic. It said that some even vomited from the sight and the stench. So what did they find in the attic? Well, get ready, because it was pretty gruesome. They found dead and rotting bodies. They found live tortured bodies with obvious, what they called, quote, experiments. This is what the newspapers reported. And here's what those consisted of. What they called a human caterpillar. It was a woman with her arms amputated and her skin peeled off in circular patterns resembling the segments of a caterpillar. So that's why they called her a human caterpillar. They found a woman who had her arms and legs broken and reset, where they healed in a twisted, inhuman way to make her look like a crab. They found a woman who was naked and chained up and hanging. Her stomach had been cut open and her intestines had been pulled out and wrapped around her waist like a belt. And then this one's pretty brutal. They found a woman with animal feces in her mouth, which was sewn shut. Her mouth was sewn shut, and when they got her mouth, they pulled the stitches out, got her mouth open, they discovered that there was animal feces sitting in her mouth. Now they say that this suggests that Delphine actually had help with her torture, because it would take at least one other person to hold the woman down while the feces were put in her mouth and while her mouth was sewn shut. I doubt that, even though if the slaves were afraid of her, I doubt anybody would just sit still while they had their mouth sewn shut. So they think she had to have had accomplices, at least one accomplice, and most likely her husband. They also found a woman who was stuffed into a tiny metal cage meant for dogs. Her bones were twisted and broken in order to fit her into that tiny little cage. Several of the victims that they found were missing arms and legs. They found a bunch of skulls that had holes drilled in them. And there was one man found still alive with a hole drilled in his head. And that hole was filled with maggots. He was alive. He had a hole in his head. His brain was exposed. And there was maggots, living maggots, all crawling around in that hole. And that's not all. Not just the maggots. There was a stick protruding from the hole. And it was said that that stick was used to stir his brains. When they found the other skulls with holes in them, they found sticks and spatulas that it's reported that that's what she did. She would drill holes in their heads, and then she would stick the ends of these spatulas and these sticks in their head and stir their brains up. Reports say that this was actually a pretty common practice of hers. I don't even want to think what that feels like. I mean, what's the purpose? What is she trying to make them dumb? Is she trying to make them smart? What's the purpose? Is she just enjoy watching the look on their face when she does it? Like, why do you want to stir somebody's brains? Bizarre, twisted, and I can imagine unbelievably painful. No wonder her slaves were jumping off the roof and trying to set themselves on fire, because they don't want their brains stirred. They found people chained up and hanging where it was obvious that they had been hanging there for long periods of time. It's said that she would leave them hanging for months, just keeping them alive in order to torture them by letting them hang for months, not letting them die. It's said that they found bodies and people pinned to tables, that they found body parts and organs. Now, again, there was some exaggerated reports. They know that there were rumors going around, and these are all the things that were reported. But at the same time, there are witness reports from people who actually went into the attic, who said there were only between 7 and 9 people in the attic. So when they say there were people pinned to tables, most likely it was just one person, and maybe they found bodies pinned to the tables. Not exactly sure. Because of so many rumors and exaggerations, it's kind of hard to determine which is true. So basically, The ones that were reported in multiple papers are the ones that have kind of survived today as, hey, this is what happened. They also found a lot of horrific devices that she had used on the slaves. They found shackles of all different shapes and sizes, and a lot of iron collars with the inward-facing spikes. This was so that the slaves' necks were punctured if they breathe or if they move their head. Some of them would try to hold their breath until they passed out, but eventually they were killed by the spikes, because even if you pass out, your head's going to slump over and it's going to puncture your neck. But I guess it's better for it to happen when you're passed out and not able to feel it than for it to happen when you're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Now, there are stories that claim that she treated her male slaves even worse. And the bodies that were found in the attic kind of back that up. The male bodies that were found had their fingernails removed, their eyes gouged out, and their genitals removed. Most of them were already deceased, but those who were alive, when they were found in the attic, begged to be put out of their misery. They begged to be killed because they were suffering so much because of the torture. So they found all this. They were horrified, but they're faced with this, and the house is on fire. So they kick the door down, they vomit, they're like, oh my God. But at the same time, they're like, okay, we don't even have time to absorb the shock of what we're witnessing. We've got to get these people out. So they got the slaves out of the house, and they tended to them with food, water, and medical attention. Once they've got the slaves taken care of, all of the neighbors and the townspeople waited outside of the house for the sheriff to come to do something about Delphine because of what happened in the attic. Yeah, I mean, this word spread like wildfire through the whole town because all the people in the town showed up. It was a big fire, a big deal. It's said that there were about 4,000 people there. They were very, very angry. Regardless of her status, she lost her status the instant they kicked that door in. They were very angry about what they saw, how she had treated the slaves. But the sheriff never showed up. So that just made them even more angry. And they mobbed the house. They mobbed, pillaged, stole whatever they could steal. They destroyed the walls, the floors. They didn't destroy, between them destroying the house and the fire. They did this while the house was on fire. The fire wasn't put out. The house is burning down. And they're going in, stealing anything that they could, and trying to tear the house up. So this house just took a massive beatdown. They nearly destroyed the house, but they didn't. Finally, the sheriff shows up to break up the mob. How crazy is that? He wouldn't show up because of how Delphine had treated her slaves, but he shows up to break up the mob. You know, when the mob mobs a house, Delphine had disappeared. The mob of people just was destroying the house. The sheriff had showed up, but Delphine had disappeared. She fled because she feared that she would be arrested or something, and she actually escaped the country and went to France to live with her family there. Judge Jean-Francois, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, I'm probably not, but I think it's Canonge, Canonge. He was a witness who entered the mansion and entered the attic to help the slaves, and he claims that when he was in the attic, that he saw a slave woman with an iron collar with spikes, and that he saw an elderly woman with a very deep wound in her head who was unable to walk. He didn't say much else. That's the only thing he claimed when he was actually deposed about the whole thing. When he went into the house and went into the attic and then came outside, Delphine and her husband at that time were still there. They hadn't fled yet. He came outside infuriated, and he went up to Delphine's husband and he asked him about the slaves. Like, dude, what's going on? What on earth are you doing to your slaves? And her husband said, quote, "Some people had better stay at home rather than come to others' houses to dictate laws and meddle with other people's business." Which is basically, dude, mind your business. It's none of your business what I do to my slaves. And because of him saying that, that's why it's believed that he was probably the one who was Delphine's accomplice. He probably was right there with her. He might have even taught her, because up until this point, she had never been known to treat her slaves poorly. She had actually been known to have freed a couple of her slaves. It's like she married this guy and she snapped for whatever reason. So, some people think that maybe he's the one that taught her, and maybe once she got a taste for it, she just liked it a little bit too much. No one really knows for sure. So they rescued the slaves, and then the sheriff shows up and he takes the slaves to the local jail for public viewing so that everybody could see what Delphine did. And this, again, they said that about 4,000 people went by to look at them. Not long after the fire, the newspapers reported that the ground had also been excavated after the fire, and that several bodies and remains were found in the ground as well. They said that a well had been searched and the remains of a child were found in that. Later in 1836, now remember, the fire happened April 10th, 1834. So later on in 1836, there were reports that said that the slaves in the attic were emaciated, that their skin was flayed from being whipped, and that they were bound in restrictive postures, meaning that they were bound up in positions where they couldn't move. Now, it's said that when she fled, she went to Mobile, Alabama first, and then she went to Paris, France. Not much is really known about her life after that, because, she kind of fled and lived a secret life in order to escape prosecution, until a copper plate was found in the St. Louis cemetery, and it had her name on it, and the date of her death, and that she died in Paris. In 1836, Harriet Martineau wrote a book that extensively documented the LaLaurie story. And here's a quote from that book. "A horrible sight met their eyes. Of the 9 slaves, the skeletons of 2 were afterward found poked into the ground. The other 7 could scarcely be recognized as human. Their faces had the wilderness of famine, and their bones were coming through the skin. They were chained and tied in constrained postures, some on their knees, some with their hands above their heads. They had iron collars with spikes which kept their heads in one position. The cowhide, stiff with blood, hung against the wall, and there was a stepladder on which this fiend stood while flogging her victims in order to lay on the lashes with more effect." She was a very sadistic woman. I would have to agree, right up there with Elizabeth Bathory. My heart goes out to her victims, to the slaves. I mean, it was bad enough to be a slave to begin with, but to wind up with her as your owner, it's just unfathomable. So let's talk about the actual house, the mansion, the LaLaurie Mansion or LaLaurie House. It's naturally, after all of this, it's said to be haunted and cursed. It had finally been fully repaired before 1888, but there were some repairs done, enough to make it livable in 1836. It was finally placed on the market in 1837, and it was purchased by just some random man. And he only lived there for 3 months. Why? Because it was haunted. He experienced strange noises, moans, and cries at night, and he just up and abandoned the home because it freaked him out so much. He tried to rent the rooms in the home out as apartments because, he sunk his money into this house. It's not easy to just up and leave your house. So he tried to rent some of the rooms out, but it was unsuccessful because people, when they did go to rent the rooms out, they wouldn't stay more than a few nights. They would get freaked out from all the noises, and they would leave. He finally gave up, and the house was completely abandoned yet again. Now fast forward to after the Civil War. During the Reconstruction, it was turned into a desegregated high school for, quote, girls of the lower district. And in 1874, the White League forced the black children to leave the school. They segregated it. A short time after that, the school board turned it into a black girls only school. Now, this black girls only school only lasted for a year. After that, it was shut down until 1882, when an English teacher came in and turned it into a very prestigious, quote, conservatory of music and fashionable dancing school. Now, at this school, some of the richest and most prominent families sent their children there because of the reputation of the English teacher. And it's odd because in my research, I couldn't find whether this English teacher was a male or female. I think it was a male, but everything just refers to this person as the English teacher. It was really weird to not see this person referred to as him or her. So the school did really well until one day the newspaper printed accusations that the teacher had sexually abused some of the female students. Well, that, of course, didn't sit well with people. They immediately, and when I say immediately, I mean immediately, shunned the school. It literally shut down the very next day. After the newspaper article came out, it shut down the next day, and yet again the mansion became abandoned. In 1892, the body of Jules Vignie, I guess that's how you pronounce it, it's Vigne. He was an eccentric member of a local wealthy family. Well, he was found dead on a tattered cot and in filth in the mansion. He had apparently been living there secretly since the late 1880s, like I guess right after the school shut down. The mansion was completely filthy and run down, but he had been living there secretly. Once his body was found, the mansion was searched, and they found some of these things stashed away in several of the rooms. Antiques and treasure. I'm not sure what they mean by treasure, probably things like jewelry and stuff like that. They found a bag with several $100s near his body. And remember, we're talking about the late 1800s, so several $100 was a lot of money. And then they found several $1,000s hidden in his mattress. And again, that is a lot of money for that time period. We're talking about probably the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars. After that, naturally, rumors circulated for years that there was hidden treasure in the mansion, but people were always too scared to go in and look for it. And by the way, no hidden treasure has ever been found there. It was just rumored. You know, people find out that there was antiques and jewelry and whatnot and money found there, so of course there's going to be stories that, hey, he could have hidden stuff in the walls or something like that. So they found his body. It's still abandoned up until the late 1890s. During this time is when there was a wave of Italian immigrants coming in to New Orleans. They came in and they bought up a whole bunch of properties and they turned them into really, really cheap apartments. The LaLaurie Mansion was one of those buildings that they bought and turned into apartments. But it didn't work out too well for them. The hauntings of the mansion and the strange happenings there in the house caused the renters to leave pretty quickly. Just like the guy who tried to turn it into apartments and rent out the rooms. Those people didn't stay but a couple days. Well, the same here. Even though the rent was some of the cheapest rent in town, basically, because of the haunting in the mansion, people did not stay there. And word very quickly spread that the house was haunted, and eventually nobody would rent the apartments. And the mansion was abandoned again. This house has been abandoned many times. Later on down the road, it would become a saloon and then a furniture store. The saloon actually took advantage of the history. It was named the Haunted Saloon, and the owner would actually make notes of the different strange happenings. It's kind of funny, even though it's been reported that he kept notes and a log of the strange happenings there, there's no log out there. Like, of all the information we have, we don't have a copy of this log. I couldn't find it anywhere. So he, maybe he just took it with him when he shut the saloon down. I don't know. Not really sure what happened to the saloon. Not sure why it shut down. I couldn't really find any information about that. But after the saloon shut down, a furniture store went in, and they didn't last very long either. That furniture store closed down due to the severe haunting of the mansion, which I will actually tell you about later, because now I'm going to get into the haunting stories, and I'm going to tell you about the furniture store. So yes, the house, the mansion, is definitely said to be haunted, and it is said to be the most haunted place in New Orleans, which is got to be pretty bad, because New Orleans has got a reputation of being pretty haunted. A lot of homes and buildings there are pretty haunted. So what are some of these haunting ghost stories? Well, I already told you about the guy who bought it in 1837. You know, he heard wails and screams and bangs and things like that. Well, let's fast forward to the 1890s when it was an apartment building. And this is where we really start getting into finding some stories. One tenant there said that he saw one night a naked black man in chains who chased him down the hall, cornered him, attacked him, and then vanished. There are several claims that animals had been mysteriously killed, mutilated, and butchered while inside the house. Mysteriously. They would just show up, butchered and mutilated and dead, but nobody could ever figure out how. Children were attacked by a phantom with a whip. This is one of the claims, one of the stories people have reported. Strange figures have been seen in shrouds. One woman saw a figure of a woman in an evening gown huddled over her sleeping infant child, which they speculate was Delphine herself, even though Delphine didn't die in this home. There have been screams, wails, groans, cries, and so on. You know, all these different sounds that we would find at a typical haunting. And they were regularly heard throughout the house at night, like every night. Now, when it was the saloon owner actually used the hauntings and happenings as a selling point of the saloon. I mean, naturally, he called it the haunted saloon. But let me tell you about the furniture store, because this one is pretty out there. It seems to have been the worst haunting of it. I guess whoever was there really did not like that it was a furniture store. Either that or they just did not like the owner. The owner suspected that it was vandals initially, because he kept finding all of his merchandise ruined and covered in some sort of dark, smelly liquid on multiple occasions. He would shut the furniture store down for the night, go home, go to bed, come in the next morning and open it, and everything would just be destroyed and covered in this weird, funky liquid. So he got fed up. One night, he stayed in the furniture store and he waited there with a shotgun, hoping to catch the vandals. But he fell asleep. And when he woke up in the morning, all of the furniture was ruined again, even though nobody had come inside the building. The doors were locked, nobody had broken in, everything was ruined. Once he witnessed that, he closed the store down permanently and abandoned the home. Again, abandoned. So those are the stories about the hauntings, at least the ones that I could find. There is a ghost tour that has a stop at the LaLaurie Mansion. They don't go inside, but they do stop at the LaLaurie Mansion, and they do tell some stories about the mansion. So if you're at New Orleans, hop on one of those ghost tours, and you can see the mansion and hear maybe more haunting stories than these. What about present day? What about the newer history of the home? Well, the current owners, when they renovated it, they discovered a makeshift graveyard with shallow graves and poorly buried remains underneath the wooden floor. Like somebody just tossed. Basically, they're saying that that's what it was. It was believed to be Madame LaLaurie's graveyard, that she quickly just peeled up the floorboards and stashed the bodies underneath them in order to avoid being discovered. I mean, you couldn't just go out and bury them in the backyard because you already did and it's already full. You know, they already found bodies in the backyard. So apparently she must have ran out of room in the backyard, so she was stashing them under her floorboards. In 2007, April of 2007, Nicolas Cage, the actor, bought the house for $3.45 million, hoping that it would help inspire him to write a dark novel, but it didn't. He never got the novel written. Soon after he bought the house, actually 2 years later in 2009, this is when Nicolas Cage wound up going bankrupt. He lost the house to foreclosure. People say that it's because of the house's curse. You know, you notice a pattern here. Everybody who tries to do anything with this mansion winds up failing. It doesn't work out, and they wind up abandoning the house. It's a pattern. So that's why people believe that the house is cursed. And they believe Nicolas Cage, you know, shortly after he moved in, that's when he just went into financial ruin and lost the home. And people believe that it's because of the curse of the house. It's currently luxury apartments for wealthy people. And again, like I said, the ghost tours stop outside of it and they tell stories, but you can't go inside because they're private residences. People walking by, though, and people on these ghost tours have reported hearing faint screams coming from inside. They've reported being nauseous when they get in front of the home. And a lot of people have photographed orbs around the house. You know, they take pictures of the house and it shows up with a lot of orbs in it. This is a pretty big landmark, pretty twisted story. I think she's definitely right up there with Elizabeth Bathory. These women getting their hair pulled when they get their hair brushed, and then they just snap and start torturing people. It's maybe she was Elizabeth Bathory reincarnated. Kind of bizarre. Maybe that's why she freaked out when the girl snagged her hair. If you want to learn about Elizabeth Bathory, be sure to check out episode 1 of my podcast, because that episode is all about Elizabeth Bathory and her cruel, torturous, murderous ways. So if you haven't listened to it yet, be sure to check that episode out. But anyways, one last note before I wrap this episode up. In case you didn't catch on, Kathy Bates played Madame LaLaurie in American Horror Story Coven, and again in American Horror Story Hotel. So in case you hadn't put 2 and 2 together, Kathy Bates played her, that this whole story was kind of written into American Horror Story. And it is an American Horror Story in and of itself. Also, a quick last minute note. When Nicolas Cage owned the house, he was approached many times by paranormal teams wanting to investigate, and he refused. He would not allow them because he felt like it would be exploiting the spirits there. But anyways, this home, most haunted place in New Orleans, it's got a pretty twisted history, a really twisted serial killer woman who loved to torture, and it's got a long history of being abandoned, and you can still see it standing today. I think it's 3 stories now when it's been rebuilt, and you know, over the years it's 3 stories now. At least that's what it looks like in the pictures. But if you wind up going to New Orleans, be sure to go check it out. Either just go walk by it and check it for yourself, or take one of the ghost tours to check it out and hear some of the stories. But please do not go inside and or knock on these people's doors, because they are private residences. There's really no haunting stories coming out from the current residents, but respect their privacy, admire it from the outside, don't bother the people that live there. That's the story of Madame Marie Delphine LaLaurie, the brutal, torturing female serial killer who is right along there with Elizabeth Bathory. That's it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it. What did you think? Do you have a story of your own? Have you been to the mansion? Did you experience anything? Did you hear anything when you went to see it? Let me know. I would love to hear people's stories. Submit a story on the website, www.peculiartalk.com. Send me a message on the website, post a comment on Podomatic or on Facebook. I would love to hear your stories. If I get enough stories, maybe I'll do an episode one day just of stories about New Orleans. Even if you don't have a story about this particular mansion, tell me your ghost story or your strange story of weird happenings in New Orleans. So again, that's it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Next week, I am going to do a possession story, a demonic possession story. So be sure to come and check back for that. Thanks for listening.